I am still saying Happy New Year. It is still a beautiful time. I'm currently sitting here in Washington, D.C. With Cat Goughnour, who is our guest Fireside Chat speaker today. We're going to let a few more people join us. I hope that the semi-rain slash snow showers in this area didn't prevent people from coming to join today, but we're super excited about our second Fireside Chat in a series that we're focusing on really lifting up what we believe are emerging practices in the field to support organizations led by and serving communities of color to be more effective. And thank you for joining us today. We're going to give people just a couple of minutes to enter the space with us, and we're going to get started. So I'm just going to give people about one more minute. Thank you so much for joining us today. We ask that you mute yourselves during the call, just so that we're respectful of our speaker and the fact that we're also recording our conversation today. We want to make it available for those who are not able to join us. So thank you in advance for that. Also want to let you know that we have our chat open for questions. So I will be monitoring the chat box, and that's going to be available for all of us towards the end of the call. We will reserve about 15 or so minutes from questions from the field. If you so choose, if you want to ask Kat a question, just feel free to go ahead and drop that question into the chat box for me. Here we go. So as our advertisement noted, Enterprise and Ventures of Color, EVC, is so excited to bring together voices of leaders from across the country with the intentional focus on sharing information and really, for me, yielding power, because information is power for organizations who may not be connected to networks and systems. And we have invited Cat Goughnour to join us today. Way back when this woman here who's joining us today was actually a recipient of technical assistance services that my team was providing and designing at NAACP, and then the project then transitioned over to Prosperity Now. That particular project was focused on African American financial capability in the Northwest. And Kat, a recipient of one of the organizations, came to the convening because at that point she had been elevated to be a part of the team. And through that work, she was hired to join Prosperity Now. And a significant moment, I think, in our history in the organization to have someone that was on the front lines of service delivery, then working at a national intermediary organization to help design the future of technical assistance for this organization. Kat stayed at Prosperity Now for over 5 years. And continued to excel, so much so that she then became an advisor for philanthropy. I would like to personally spotlight the work that she did with the Kresge Foundation and really supporting organizations in place, very similar to the organization that she came from, she started in, to think about how do they design their programs to yield power and also to pick the hearts and minds of those in positions of power. She then continued the great work, right, that she started as now an architect in the public sector, where Kat is serving in my home state of Maryland, as Assistant Secretary for Just Communities under Governor Wes Moore. And as if all of that isn't enough, right? All of that work really of thinking about how does she learn from being in community space to working at a community organization, to working at a national intermediary, to then advising philanthropy. Now she's yielding her energy towards the public sector. And then I'm sorry, is it that wasn't enough? I already said that part. But now she's also the CEO of Radix Consulting Group. In her role with Radix Consulting Group, is a for-profit human rights organization whose mission is healing systems and changing systems. Kat has received numerous awards for her work as founder and CEO of Radix Consulting Group. And what I love about, that practice is, one, I want to name that it is a for-practice entity, which gives her so much liberation. And there's freedom, right, in that part of the work. So she brings this complete amazing journey. The other piece I'll say is she's a dear friend. So you all will continue to meet the people that Lillian Rowe was in real life that keep her honest as founder and CEO of Enterprise and Ventures of Color, who challenges her intellectually. And as a true friend of mine, the conversations we've had around design, the arguments we've had around implementation, I am so blessed and excited that she continued to journey to be on the front lines. So today we're going to be talking about how CAT has strengthened community-based organizations' ability to leverage resources as power brokers and change agents across 15 cities and 13 states. I'm going to say that again. 15 cities and 13 states, where she's leveraged millions of dollars in capital to effectively support them as they advocate for systems change, which is an essential step that she believes to racial economic equity. So, Kat, thank you again for being with us, for agreeing to just be in dialogue. And the first thing I would just ask you is this. What's the heartbeat behind you? I kind of shared a little bit about who you are as a person and then your career trajectory, but what's your heartbeat? Like, what's your why for doing this work?
Well, thank you, Lillian. It's an honor to be here. It's a privilege to be able to work alongside you for so long, spearheading work that hadn't been done before with the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, and really thinking about how do we resource communities, the leaders in communities who have really innovative and thoughtful ways to change the economic circumstance of people. And so I am so grateful for your mentorship, your leadership, your sisterhood. And I am because we are, and I am grateful for that. I think my heartbeat is being the change I want to see in the world. I come from a very non-traditional background of lived experience, and the ways that I've been able to change outcomes for people through my learned experience is something that I think doesn't get enough airtime. I don't know that we often understand what it takes to affect change and to move into different spaces. And so for me, it's really being authentic, being unapologetic, being able to be the person that I needed when I was younger. Many of us come from really hard childhoods, from struggle. And my quest and question is how to turn pain into power. And so my work has really been leveraging everything, if it's education, if it's entrepreneurship, if it's employment, how do I use those as springboards to always keep people at the center, to make sure that we are serving those who are furthest from justice and ensuring that the last shall be the first.
Hmm. Thank you, Kat. Kindred spirits from the very beginning when we met years ago. And as you know, I am hosting this today, really in part to provide even more fortification to the Flint, Michigan ecosystem, where the Flint cohort, I see some of you guys on the call today. Welcome. Thank you for joining. Is really trying to think through and partner with me as they develop their own personal leadership development and strengthen who they are as individuals, to who they then want to be and know they can be as leaders of their respective entities and their organizations. So personal leadership and identity I believe is so core to your ability to make any level of impact. So How does your identity impact your leadership, Kat? And what energizes you, right, to do really, really hard work?
Hard work and hard work, right? Um, well, I really believe that it is being bold, being courageous, being prepared to be told no, and doing it anyway. Being able to do it scared, I think, is something that has been kind of, the heartbeat of my life, coming from a background where, I was a high school dropout. I didn't go to university until I was 30 years old. I worked in very low level jobs for a significant amount of my life. So, when I'm talking about the people, I know firsthand what that's like, right? And being able to dream bigger, to understand that if I can't see the thing that I need, and that my people need, and that people across this country need, that we can build it. We can build it, we can design it. I was an artist in my former life, a fashion designer. You have to make something out of a piece of fabric by drafting and drafting and drafting and trying again. And then eventually you end up with something very beautiful. So being able to iterate, um, being comfortable with it not being perfect the first time, I think is the beautiful thing about having worked in all these cities with, I think it's like 60 to 70 organizations led by Black and Brown people, who are really committed to solving racial, economic, and wealth inequality, even when they are service providers who are limited in who they can serve by virtue of the funding they receive, 0 to 80% area median income. How do you build wealth when people haven't even been able to cover their basic needs, right? And how do we do both at the same time? Because we can't wait. We all have
Mhm.
one life. And I think the thing that energizes me the most, and this might resonate with you, Lillian, I'm a big dreamer. And I always said the money was going to come. That there would be a shift. I studied philosophy. So thinking about this enlightenment or this reckoning that the United States is having about the causes of inequality, the structural nature of that, the systems that hold it in place, who is benefiting from oppression. I'm seeing so many reports being written by public sector, private sector, philanthropy about their role in inequalities, and kind of this moment where they're calling themselves into the conversation. And I think, 5, 7 years ago, we could never have imagined necessarily. I think we dreamed that there would be a moment where this subject, this work wouldn't be taboo, where we would find like hearts and like minds across different sectors who also needed to understand how might we build something that can change 400, 500 years of oppression and economic inequality. And the thing that energizes me is I open my computer every morning and I'm reading. I'm just reading so many things that are giving life, for something that is hard. It's long standing, but I feel more hopeful now than ever before, because it isn't singular voices, and it isn't only the people with lived experience. It's a lot of people who are ready to ally, who are ready to champion and partner with the people most impacted. So I
Mhm.
love this moment for that.
Thank you, Kat. You've already started, talking about your approach, right, to this work and what you were just sharing. And can't even believe it, 60 to 70 organizations, except for I kind of do. I was there with you for some of that. And I know, the people who are behind those organizations really is, the reason, right, that energized us when we were working together, when we were collaborating. So when you think about your approach, what is the secret sauce of organizations that you've supported across these cities, um, that has supported their ability, right, to raise capital or pull on state or federal levels for funding and impact? Because I think that a lot of organizations are at this nexus of, I want to do so much,
Mhm.
and the resources are not always there, right, available for me. So can you just talk about like how you've helped, some organizations think about that or navigate that?
Absolutely. And I think the secret sauce of these organizations, to your point, is their hunger. They're ready for this. They've been wanting this forever. So the will is there. And one of the things that I think is so important in thinking about technical assistance, capacity building, and society in general, why do these inequalities persist? It's the skill, right? And we're kind of in this moment where it's all an experiment. Nobody
Mhm.
has the playbook, to your point. We kind of had to write one after a project because, fits and starts, false starts, changes, pivots, and then finally, I remember when the pandemic happened, and people were like, how are y'all going to pivot? And I remember talking to you, I said, we're going to double down. Because at that time, after doing the work for so many years with partners on the ground who, let me know this is hard.
Mhm.
You're breaking my heart. Like, how do I do this? But what they needed, I realized, is a process, a very simple process that allows them to lean into a problem. Remember that first time we brought the data to our groups and people cried, seeing the level of income inequality, the level of asset poverty, the level of debt that our communities hold. It seems insurmountable and it seems
Mhm.
like a foregone conclusion. So, how do you help people turn that pain into
Mhm.
power, even if they're not living it, right? And so, being able to really think about how can we use data? How do we use research to understand what's causing the problem? How this data shows us the consequences in the lives of the people in our environment, and then really thinking about what's the cure.
Mhm.
There are so many different cures, and that was something that I was asked. Well, what solution do you bring to the people? And I said, oh, I don't bring the solution. I bring the process, and they create the product. They create the pilot, the program, and then I designed some survey instruments, different ways that people can evaluate in real time, as they're testing this thing. Is it having the impact that they want? If not, do they need to build more? Do they need to draw down more resources, to your point? And often it's about how do we partner in a different way with existing resources who also have the same income and asset criteria for their
Mhm.
funds. And we wrote reports about this, right? The workforce development, how do you do policy and advocacy, putting racial economic equity into those different ways of thinking about existing power structures. And the people were able then to design things that have taken off exponentially. They've also been able to create really interesting things like impact funds. We often think that what we need to do is this downstream approach, just pulling bodies out of the river. How do we save and band-aid the situation? But a lot of people, when they looked at this painful data, said, we need our own institutions.
That's right.
We actually don't have to become another nonprofit or a for-profit or philanthropy or a governmental partner to access those dollars. And what I help them to do, my mom calls me an interpolator, which is, an interpreter, how to help make accessible the language of systems to the people so that we can write that into our applications and demonstrate to philanthropy, who is a thought leader around collective impact. But they
Mhm.
didn't know how to measure it. So my thing was, if they don't know how to measure it and we have all these outcomes, how do we frame our applications in a way and put enough zeros? And we'll get back to
Mhm.
that later. But really, changing the paradigm of this is not a $200,000 grant. This is not a $500,000 grant. If we're really trying to overcome an $825,000 gap for every individual, and there's research around that, then we have to really think about millions of dollars that are owed to the community, and how do we directly pass those through? Because programs and services are wonderful, but what people really need is to have resources and money in their pockets. And so that's the other, I think, really innovative approach. Most all of the groups I worked with started compensating people at an extreme amount of money, or like we would say, like consultants, for
That
their
that
lived
part.
experience. So, being able to actually give resources to people so we're not extracting their lived
Mhm.
experience, their pain, their struggle, but actually being able to provide the resources and capital people need to change their own lives.
That's right. I love it. And there's no surprise, right? When I launched EVC 18 months ago, I really rooted it in three areas that we wrote about a lot, right? That we designed around or solutions around. a lot, and just very unapologetic, right? And I think it's because of, and I'm excited to be able to say this, both our lived experience, but then our academic experience, our nonprofit industrial complex experience, our philanthropy experience, and the gaps or the challenges still remain the same. like at the individual level, the way we used to talk about it, is at the individual level, is at the communal level, is at the institutional level, right? These gaps. And the three gaps is the racial capacity building gap, racial leadership gap, and racial funding gap. And you see it throughout every level of governance or, society. And our approach to capacity building has always been to turn that upside down, right? To really enter communities with this real amazing, like they are brilliant mindset. Like they have so much to offer, and to equip them, right, with what we found to be the most effective. And we can still be wrong until we're deep, deep in relationship so that we can learn from them. So can you speak, just speaking to the first gap, Kat, like in expanding your practice, right, from the nonprofit to now government, congratulations, I know you're newly there, but even your own firm that you've had for a decade, what has been kind of like the core part when you think about capacity building gaps for organizations and the challenges they've had to overcome, like what has been like the most like largest mental challenge you think, but then like the fundamental tool or tools or practices you felt like has really helped move these 60 to 70 organizations over 15 cities forward? Like what has worked for you in your practice?
Well, I think you named it, a strengths-based approach, an asset-based approach, being able to flip the frame. People are not deficient. They're not afraid. They don't not have trust. There are a lot of reasons that impacted communities, marginalized communities, oppressed communities are fearful of engaging with a system that by every one of these reports that I read admits harm and yet has not done enough to redress and address those things by their practice. So I think for me, what has been the most important is, leveraging my intellectual capital, but also emotional capital. And I don't even know if emotional capital is a thing, but that Cornell West quote
Mhm,
that I love, you can't save the people if you don't serve the people. You can't lead the people if you don't love the people. Leveraging the love and the service of community members in, their own positions of power to be brave, to understand, the table was not set for us. We have not been invited.
mhm,
And somebody said to me early on when I first got my first job after moving back from England in 2012, you just always show up. They're like, you're
mhm,
always in these rooms. I didn't have any idea what I was doing in those rooms, but I was listening and I was learning and I was absorbing, how the conversations unfold, thinking about the politics at play, thinking about what my mom always says, what's not being said. And being able then to figure out in the
mhm,
incubation spaces that we made, because I'm just going to name that, being able to create a safe space for learning. I think one thing you taught me early on is Black and brown poor people don't have the luxury of failure. We
mhm,
do not we often have one chance. And if we don't make the most of it because we don't have the wealth to finance things ourselves, and or there's so much stigma and shame that is ascribed to us, that we often have that one chance and then we're left behind. So
mhm,
being able to help build people's confidence. And I remember you said one thing to me early as well that really stuck with me, that I'm coachable. And that is the
mhm,
thing about the organizations that come to this racial wealth equity, racial economic equity, technical assistance capacity building. It's rigorous. That means it's so hard. I mean, you went to Stanford, I went to the London School of Economics. Like the rigor for me as a
mhm,
first generation college student, I was a fish out of water. But you know what? I stayed in there. I came up with my mantra, good paper is a done paper. I didn't know if the thing was written properly, but the format was right. I went in and I submitted it. The awesome thing there, and I think was similar to the way that we do this work, is it's then submitted to a review panel that is not your teacher. So that's the
Mhm.
thing. As an intermediary, we were not their funder.
Yep.
They didn't have to be accountable to us in those ways. So they were accountable to the work because they wanted to be there. They want to be there. They want to learn. And, suspending the disbelief of this seems really strange. How do you all know this is going to work? Right. And I say all the time the biggest poverty in the United States, and I will be very specific, is poverty of imagination. Right. And so, how do we bolster people's ability to believe that not just that we're worth it, but that we're owed all of these zeros and that we don't need them forever? What we need is an infusion to kind of, move us beyond this historical moment. And by every measure, entrepreneurship, education, employment, our people are leading in all of those sectors. So with a small infusion or investment, we then shoot the moon, as my mom would say, right? We innovate in ways that historically people have made their careers off of, right? If we couldn't hold patents, we couldn't hold trademarks, we could not own our intellectual property. In these days and times, and this is what I was teaching nonprofits of color, own it. When you make the beautiful thing, don't give it all, don't put it all on the internet, right? Hold some of it back and monetize it in a way, because that thinking is so transformational.
Mhm.
And if they are to receive the funds for the hard work they've done, unrestricted as well, right? That's what we always push for. They would be so surprised at how much they're able to make change, but also that they can get that money matched and leveraged. So
Mm.
it is a multiplier effect that I think, listening to your first speaker, Logan, you might get a seed, right? I got an IDA, an individual development account, as an entrepreneur 10 years ago. Shout out to Bob Friedman and Prosperity
Mm.
Now for that innovative way. I saved $3,000. I got $12,000. I got to buy a few things, but it was a seed, and it propelled me exponentially to be able to consult with government, local government, regional government, state government in Oregon, and then being able to come to DC, which was beyond my wildest dreams, and now really being able to think through with a very
Mhm.
progressive governmental administration, how do we make this real in a place-based way, this people making and place making, place keeping approach. So a lot of the language is jargony.
Mhm.
It's, there is a way to use words as weapons for liberation. And so that's my goal in all that I do. Um,
I love it, Kat. I love it. I have a question about your leadership, and one of the things that I appreciate you saying, because even me, I stay coachable, um, and I think that that's really difficult when you're in it and you're like facing like this mountain that you got to get a solution to. It's hard to kind of like step back, to be like, okay, let me raise up, right, to think about like the full context. So I know your career trajectory, and you talked about that here on the call. You know, if you could speak just personally, right, as a person that was on the other side, as a provider yourself of direct services to where you are now, working in government, what challenge have you had to personally navigate? And then if you can like maybe give an example of a challenge or a strategy, one of the leaders that you've coached, because you are a coach, you've coached them to actually navigate. Because I think it's so important to continue to surround yourself with the right people so that you can just keep leveling up, even though that mountain of work or that task or whatever that is there. But sometimes we get lost in that part as opposed to make sure we remain coachable and we're thinking about strategies to navigate not just that, but our career. So can you speak a little bit to that for us?
Absolutely. I mean, the challenges have been numerous, personally and professionally. But to your point, it is, finding my tribe is what I would say. people who are willing to struggle alongside, as we are making things that are defensible so that when we go out as the people that we are, who people often underestimate us. They hold very negative stereotypes of us, based on how we look, what we came from, what we did and did not do at certain milestone moments in life. It's never too late to do things, is what I will offer to people. But being able to really find your self-care practice,
Mhm.
rest, and love, being that emotional capital, emotional intelligence piece. How do we not make this transactional, right? And for me, it's never been about the title, and it's never been about the income. If I'm honest, these days, what I made in the past, and I'll just be transparent about that, right? I was a waitress for 12 years before going to university. I made $8,000 a year in rural Oregon, right? I come from a very rural background that was, very homogenous, did not look like me. And so, being able to believe that that was artificial for me, right? And to be able to think about what value and assets can I bring to this world if everybody that I encounter is going to think something less of me, right? And I think that's the thing for the people that I work with. I mean, I've worked in Tennessee and New York, in Minneapolis and Seattle. And, people always say to me, "You've never been here. How do you know what we're going through?" And I said, I haven't been there, but can I take a stab at what your data looks like? Can I guess perhaps some of the reasons that your communities are struggling? And that part is common across the
Mhm.
country. So being able to help people to not feel shame, and I'll always speak to that because we are taught to be respectable, to distance ourselves from people and communities that we love dearly if we want to make a name for ourselves, to have success in our lives. And to me, those are assets, absolutely. And so, being able to also help people to ideate, right? To
Mhm.
brainstorm and imagine what could be possible when they've been told your ideas are weird.
Mhm.
That's never going to work. No one's going to want that, right? And I will say, it takes fortitude, because we are told no all of the time, and it takes the courage of our conviction. There is something about us holding dear to, our ancestors and to the people that we love in our communities, to say they did things that no one thought could be possible. And we stand on the shoulders of giants. And so, what is that work that remains to be done? And what is my part in that work? So, the coaching part, I think, is about loving up on people. And you, more than any supervisor I've ever had in my life, give so much love. And, your purpose driven work. Um, my new mantra I told you is on walking in purpose on purpose, right? And so, how do we embody the kinds of leadership that we've never seen, but that resonates with the people who we care about, the people
That's
that,
right.
haven't yet made it into these rooms, and being able to speak life into people and
That's
supporting
right.
their ideas, and helping them to understand how that piece can map onto this bigger system that can shift power.
So shifting power, let's talk about the last gap. This is my favorite, is how do we support organizations leverage capital for change, right? We need that capital for our direct services. We need that capital for data purposes to produce data. We need the capital to pay ourselves, more than just living wages, given the amount of effort that's in this space. So a two-part question for you, and I know that we spent some time in our career doing this, is partnering with philanthropy to understand all of that. So if you can talk about your secret sauce, as you've done that, in your career, but also like if there was one thing that you supported in an organization, with and leveraging state or federal budgets for impact. Like, what was that? Like, what was their readiness for your coaching, right? Because you create the container in the process, but there's a level of readiness for their engagement, right? So if you can just speak to those two.
Sure. I'll start with this second first. So I like the term coaching because a coach, you love them and you hate them, right? And I remember, leaning into some of your projects on building high impact nonprofits, and maybe those folks weren't ready for me. But being able to say, okay, so what do you currently do? What do you do well? And workforce development. Let's take that as an example. It's one of my favorite pet peeves, and it's personal to me because when I came back from England, I was unemployed and I was homeless, and I went to organizations that looked like us, and said, "Hey, I need help getting a job, getting a house," and they said to me, "Hey, why don't you go get an education?" And I thought, well, you absolutely have not looked at my application to your services because I have 3 degrees. One is a vocational and associates, one is an undergraduate, and one is a master's. So, the practice of how we do workforce development, financial empowerment centers, how we do financial coaching, counseling, financial education, all of these things that they're ascribed to the community. How do we shift that to really be meaningful for our people? And so
Mm.
workforce development is wonderful, but it assumes that people have never had a job, that they need resume and interview skills often. And I'm just reducing it to the simplistic form, but there's a lot of money that comes to nonprofits for that. So like in my community, there are often job fairs and there are often minimum wage jobs. And I was like, I got 6-figure student loan debt. And I've been working for so many years. How do I help them to understand? Maybe you could take a different look at my application and ask me what my transferable skills are. What kinds of things have I done? And that's how I then became a consultant. That's how I moved up, became a senior program manager. How I've leveled up is some of the skills that I know are so valuable. I didn't allow people to tell me you're just like this, right? So being able to walk organizations through their program, client journey map, program mapping, thinking about where are people getting stuck and why is that happening and what else needs to be built. So that work in Long Island, they've built a whole uh, work component to a financial empowerment center that also starts to inform policy. They've rewritten curricula. Like when people lean into this, they read all these dang 80-page reports that people were like, nobody's gonna read these things, and they drank it up like it was
Mhm.
gold, like it was water, the thing that they've been missing. But I had to also explain to them, like, what do these words mean? How do you do it in practice, right? I think that is the part I think about my mom all the time because she was 20 when Jim Crow ended. And I sit with that because Jim Crow meant you could not go in. Yeah, you couldn't go into someplace to buy a thing, but you also couldn't have access to do what I was able to do, learn by being in the room. You couldn't get into the room. And so then society says, oh, well, they were lazy, they're uneducated, unmotivated, they don't want to be a part of this. And my thing is, how do I translate information to someone who has so much energy, so much power, so much heart, but never had the chance, and then was told, "Oh, well, now you're too old." Now you're too old, and we're only going to care about young people, So to me, there is something very important about understanding not just the economic impacts of inequality, but what social exclusion has
Mhm.
made, especially for African Americans, but for all people of color. You could not learn, you could not be in the room, you couldn't go to these prestigious universities and learn. In my case, I was like, I want to learn what the oppressor knows. People had asked me, why don't you go to the School of Oriental and African Studies, learn about the culture? I said, I know what it is to be Black and poor. My mom, was very clear to instill pride in me around those things. But what I didn't understand is why do people who have access to all of this knowledge and claim to be on the side of justice and equity continue to perpetuate these practices? So, rather than kind of thinking, well, it's just always going to be like this, I feel like the movement, that was started by our ancestors around economic equity, and being able to do uplift, right? Keeping our eyes on the prize, making sure that we're pouring into ourselves, but saying we are enough. We don't have to change who we are. We need to understand the system better to be able to access the dollars. And by putting zeros behind it, if we actually think about the cost of inequality, and thank goodness Dr. William Darity and Dr. Derek Hamilton and Diedrich Asante Muhammad, people have been trying to quantify what this amount is. If we're looking at $17 trillion for African Americans, and I would offer to every minoritized community, quantify it. Let's figure out how much this whole pie is for these histories of inequality. The Journal of American Medicine has recently done research about what it would mean to close the wealth gap, not to increase economic equity, but to lengthen lifespan for oppressed people. And when I saw that 17 trillion, I said, let me divide it by 43 million, because that's how many Black people. And my back of the envelope number was 850,000. They found we closed the gap by 825,000 for each individual, that people would have 5 to 7 years more life. That is a very powerful and compelling way of thinking about something that is hard and painful, but it also gives a new moral kind of purpose to why we must do this in our lifetime. And being able to flip the script or change the frame and own the narrative is what I think is a secret sauce. We have the ability not just to say, oh my gosh, we're hurting. It is, we're hurting. These are the reasons. This is what it looks like. And this is what we're going to do about it. The cause, the consequence, and the cure.
Thank you, Kat. One more set of questions, and we're going to open the floor up for questions. I think that we are yoked together because of our values and how we work with community, but also how we live our own lives. So when I established EVC, there were 3 values, that action-based principles, in fact, that I thought was going to be very necessary for me to continue to, be the evangelist around. And these words are not new to you, because I'm sure we co-ideated them together. But courageous and transformational leadership, right? Leading with courage, which you talked about before, is really important. Important principle or practice in this work, regardless of where you sit in the ecosystem. Building collective power, and like really being willing to put your ego to the side, right? Because what's the saying? Go fast, go alone, go together, go slow, or I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, but that's the essence of it, right? We have to do this together, lock arms with one another. And the last piece is, you already spoke about it today, is, rooms that you're invited in, how do you shepherd that information back to other people who didn't get an opportunity to have a seat at the table? So that's the last principle, right? Paying it forward. And so if you can just speak to, of these principles or others, right, that really root you and ground you, particularly as you take on the audacious task, and I may get this wrong as well, but the first type of agency type, or, within like Maryland state government, right? Just communities. Like that's the title of your division. I'm like, how cool is that, right? Like really naming, frankly, that there is injustice, inequities, and there's something for us to do about it. So like what principle is going to propel you as you continue to, work in this space and be proximal to those who are really furthest from justice? Can you just speak to that? And then I'm going to open the floor to questions. So if you have questions, begin to get your questions ready for Kat.
Well, I love those principles. I love that your work is rooted in, it has a principled approach. So much of what we're taught is not to, ground in things that are really important, that have a moral and ethical center, a religious center. And I think it is vital because, like you said, this work is hard. And sometimes we might not only be the only person in the room, but the only mind on a thing. And we have to be ready to heed the call to service. So paying it forward, I think, is 100%. The principle that I lean into, and I see one of my sisters on here who has an amazing nonprofit that focuses on trauma healing for Black women and girls, girls of color, women of color. When I was still, barely housed and barely employed, I created what I call the Black Women Collective in Portland. I created the Right to Root approach, which I've just received the federal trademark for. And it is unapologetically about helping Black and other minoritized people to amplify our message, but to bring that data to be able to help with this reckoning, this accounting of historical harms. And so, I think also probably if you talk to anybody I've worked with who is a person of color, I've been like, oh, you're real smart. Do you have a business? And I have helped a lot of people to kind of conceptualize what that is. I was a certified benefit corporation. I was a certified MWESB corporation. I did everything, doing too much because of coming from where I come from, where people thought we were not enough. So, don't hesitate to try. But the thing about this new role as Assistant Secretary of Just Communities, that is, what pulled me, what compelled me, what made me say yes, was that the purpose is righting the wrongs of the past. And that is such an amazing charge. The work that I've done, as you know, Lillian, it didn't exist. And many of the jobs that I've had did not exist before I held the job. So, studying philosophy, my brother told me, you're never going to get a job doing this. What are you trying to do? I said, it's a study of how to have a good life. I want to have a good life. The rest will come, right? And if I could have any job title, it would be a thinker, which is kind of doesn't exist anymore, but I love that idea because knowledge is power. And, in this moment, in this information and knowledge economy, what I would say to every person, each one, reach one, teach one. And when we are serving people who are most marginalized, we must go to them. We must humble ourselves to understand their lived experiences. We must speak life into them. And we must not, as we climb, forget about folks, as we get better job titles and more money, we're getting access to different places. We must always ensure that the resources, the capital, the money, the dollars that are needed to get people out of poverty, to get them to living wages that are pegged to the cost of living, are being returned, that we are conduits and that we are using ourselves as a vessel. And I think you always said this, no matter where we come from, we have privilege and positional power. And what you also said was, we might lose our jobs, but that is not the biggest failure, right? Because one man's trash is another man's treasure. And the reality is, if we are in purpose, on purpose, other people will see our value. They will give us opportunities that we never could have imagined and will continue to support our ability. And I say this for all of the people who've been counted out, to do things the world has not yet seen, but is very, very ready for.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you. Thank you so much, friend. Thank you so much for being available to share your experiences, the rawness, the realness of you operating in this space to avenge for what we call our frontline avengers on the front lines, really looking to really change the life trajectories of those who don't have access and opportunity. So I will turn the floor over to questions. My co-host, Jody, do we have any questions for Cat?
As of now, not yet, but we can also give them 1 or 2 more minutes
Okay, thank you.
to meditate and think of some questions.
Okay, thank you.
This is Lisa Saunders. Can I ask a question?
Sure, please, Lisa.
Hi, thank you. I'm off camera because I'm actually at an appointment, but um, I just want to say first, Kat, you are my sister and you are completely amazing. I continue to be astounded with your intellectual capital, and having been one that has benefited so greatly from that and from your passion. Um, First, just thank you. Thank you. You continue to make my sister completely proud. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because you know you and I will cry. But I want to say that I'm so intrigued doing healing work, um, how healing work downstream results in economic impact.
Mm.
And because it's one of these things that I still think is I think it's unquantifiable, but with you, I know that it is because you will do that. You will make it quantifiable if you can. So I would love for you to talk just more about that. How can we convince people that the healing of our people actually results in dollars?
Mm.
That is a
Thank you.
question. Thank you, Lisa. And yes, your sister is always with me in this work. Just for context, Lisa's sister, Sherelle, was one of the people who thought so much about my right to root process, which was working with people who were displaced or at risk of displacement by gentrification, to build a master plan using urban planners and architects, to change the narrative that Black people didn't know what they want. We just need to build this thing over here while wiping away, erasing a total culture and community in Portland, Oregon. So, you know, she spoke life into me in a way that I feel is so important. And, you know, Lisa, to your question, healing is essential. We know this. Is it quantifiable? Well, we can quantify, you know, what inequality does to lifespan. Unnatural Causes is Inequality Making Us Sick is an amazing series that came out in like 2008 that talks about how the stress, the chronic and constant stress of impoverishment impacts our vascular system. It impacts our veins. It creates plaque in our veins that causes hypertension, that causes a lot of, you know, heart disease, all of these kind of things. When we look at the disproportionality of a lot of the health impacts, so many of them are driven by stress. So number one, if we're concerned about preventative health care or harm reduction or cure, and those are kind of the frameworks of public health, you know, we have to understand that sick people can't work. But more than that, the pain that we carry because of the ways that we're treated day on day, it impacts, you know, trauma-informed theory tells us it impacts our frontal cortex. And why does that matter? Because that's our executive functioning. It's the thing that allows us to do all this complex thinking, to do things that are abstract, to be able to hold multi-phase processes, and to figure out how do we execute these things in a logical order, right? So in many ways, to me, these are purposeful impairments. If you go and read historically, people understand that these inequalities are driven by stress, and yet we're not doing anything about it. So, you know, for me, there's that argument. And then there's the argument for the people that we love is number one, I don't want anybody having to work for minimum wage. So that's real for me. When I became a consultant, I had somebody, you know, I was going to all these meetings. People were asking me to do all this free labor and I was getting tired and I was still homeless and still unemployed. I published my first peer-reviewed published article. I was interning with the city government of the Office of Equity and Human Rights. I'm like, there's something that's not translating. I need to get compensated. So I spoke to this woman who went to Harvard, this wonderful white woman who's a doctor. She was like, yeah, you should charge. I said, cool, how much should I charge? I said, I'm thinking $25 an hour. She looked at me and she's like, what? But that's, you know, my frame of reference. That was already a good wage. You know, she said, if you went to the LSE, it's, you know, an equivalent kind of university, no less than 75, I would say $150 an hour. And, you know, this for me was imaginable. I charge a lot more than that now. And so, you know, Lisa, I know that you know that's part of what I want us to understand is a part of our healing, that because the system pays us, we have wage gaps, we have wealth gaps, we get our homes taken through eminent domain, all of these different things that we don't have control over. One thing we do have control over is how much we should charge. And there is a market out there for us as experts by experience, who have lived experience, who have learned experience, as long as it's not re-traumatizing us. I think that it is a very viable new way. I'm like, this is not a way that we're taught we can actually, you know, become economically viable. But you also don't have to work 60, 80 hours a week if you are charging the right amount. So, you know, doing market analyses, these kind of things, there are ways to really understand who's getting paid often for appropriating our work from us. And that's what I learned in those meetings. Some people who didn't have a lived experience were picking up what I was putting down. They were putting it in applications and they were getting paid. So disrupting that process and being able to, you know, you can speak to it, sis. I know you can, Lillian, as can I. Like, you have to dream and make it manifest. But once you can be in safe spaces where women like us will tell it, you know, used to earn $8,000 a year. I am not joking. And you know, how you can change your economic life by being the same person, having the same principles. But the healing part, sometimes we have to do it while we're healing as well.
Thank you, Kat. Well, as we round out, we have one question from the field, and I'm going to actually drop our latest blog into the chat for everyone, because what I appreciated about what you've said is understanding the power that we have and really wanting to preserve life, right, in place. So I would also like to thank the funders of the work in Flint, CS Mott Foundation, Ruth Mott Foundation, Community Foundation of Greater Flint, and United Way for supporting this cohort, so that this is one of the mechanisms that we pay it forward. And the question that we have from Ms. Joyce James is, you talked about data. We love Joyce. And the utility of that data. We may not have time to go into it in this call, but people are hungry to understand where to get it so they can weaponize it. And in this report, for all of those who live in the Flint area, we are officially releasing the report on Thursday as a part of a capstone salon dinner. But to the point around, how do you use data to demonstrate the power of preserving life? For all of you all that live in the Flint, Michigan area, I hope that this report propels you and supports you as you continue to work on the front lines. So, Kat, as we close, and you can just think about, you know, where do you get your data? Like when you're thinking about this, and we can send a resource out to all those who participated on our call today. As Kat finalizes her last remarks around that question, I also ask that you please complete the survey that was dropped into the chat. It helps informs how we continue to offer services to you all. And there's also a $50 Amazon gift card raffle, just saying. That may entice you to give us just more information about, we're in a series. We have 4 more to go. Thank you, Kat, for being our February speaker, our Black History Month speaker. So as we close, data. How do we think about data, and like, where do we get that from so that we can actually weaponize it for our futures?
So, you know, I'm simple. I use their data. I actually don't like to make my own data because it's highly contested. You know, how big is the sample size? At what level of geography is it? How can you tell? So one of the ways that I was able to do it, we had a report that came out in Oregon. It was around the county's public health. Public health is a very good department to find data because they look at all these different indicators. And, you know, I just read data differently. And that's what I would say. I love social math. I'm not a data scientist. people. Listen, I could not. So being able to think about what conclusions are they drawing from data? And then what conclusions do I draw from data based on what I've lived, but also what I've learned? So I read very broadly. I read, a liberal arts degree. So I will read medical journals. I will read economic journals. I will read political science journals. I will read anything, because what I found is it always says, and this is so wonderful, except for these people. And these people are always women, they're always low income, they're always people of color. So when you bring in that other analysis, and that's, I think Lily and you and I've talked about this, we don't need any more data in this world. It's how we tell the story around the data and being able to put our lived experiences in that data to show if we